Some letters arrived too late to save anyone. In the autumn of 2019, a Chicago postal worker sorting through a backlog of undeliverable mail discovered an envelope wedged behind a sorting machine. The paper had yellowed. The ink had faded. The postmark read, November 1991. Inside was a confession. The letter described a crime that had never been solved. It named a victim whose disappearance had been filed away decades earlier, and it identified a killer no one had suspected. By the time the envelope reached the Chicago Police Department's cold case unit, the person who wrote it was already dead. The victim had been gone for 28 years. And the truth had been waiting in silence, trapped between metal gears and forgotten mail. This is the story of a man who vanished without explanation, a case that went cold before it ever got warm, and a confession that arrived a generation too late. Chicago, 1991. The city was caught between eras. The skyline still bore the scars of industrial decline, but new glass towers were beginning to rise. The loop hummed with commuters. The L trains rattled overhead, and in the neighborhoods beyond downtown, life moved at a rhythm shaped by routine and anonymity. It was a time before surveillance cameras on every corner, before cell phones tracked every movement, before digital footprints made disappearing nearly impossible. In that world, a person could vanish and leave almost nothing behind. Michael Brennan was 34 years old in the fall of 1991. He worked as an accountant for a mid-sized firm in the Loop. He lived alone in a modest apartment in Lincoln Park. He had no wife, no children, no close family in the city. His parents had retired to Arizona. His younger sister lived in Boston. He was, by all accounts, unremarkable, quiet, methodical, the kind of man who blended into the background of urban life. On the morning of October 18, 1991, Michael left his apartment at 7:30, as he did every weekday. He wore a navy suit and carried a leather briefcase. A neighbor saw him lock his door. Another saw him waiting at the bus stop on Clark Street. He never arrived at work. His secretary called his apartment that afternoon. No answer. She called again the next morning. Still nothing. By Monday, his supervisor contacted the building manager, who entered the apartment with a spare key. Everything was in order. The bed was made. The dishes were washed. The mail sat unopened on the kitchen counter. There were no signs of struggle, no evidence of hurried departure. Michael's wallet, keys, and briefcase were gone, suggesting he had left for work as planned. But after that Friday morning, no one saw him again. The initial police report classified Michael Brennan as a missing person. Detectives canvassed his neighborhood, interviewed co-workers, and checked hospitals and morgues. They found nothing. No witnesses, no leads, no body. Within weeks, the case file grew thin. Michael had no known enemies, no financial troubles, no history of mental illness or substance abuse. He was simply a man who had walked out of his apartment one October morning and disappeared into the city. The file was eventually moved to a storage room in the basement of the district station. The case remained open technically, but no one was actively working it. Michael Brennan became a name in a database, a face in a missing persons bulletin that yellowed and curled at the edges. Years passed. The city changed. The skyline grew taller. Technology advanced. The world became smaller and more connected. But Michael Brennan remained missing. And then, in 2019, a letter surfaced. The envelope was addressed to the Chicago Police Department, but it had never been delivered. Somehow, it had slipped behind a sorting machine at a postal facility on the south side. It had remained there, hidden and forgotten, for nearly 3 decades. When the letter was finally opened, the words inside were clear, despite the faded ink. I killed Michael Brennan. I need someone to know. The confession was brief. It described a confrontation, a moment of rage, a decision made in seconds that could not be undone. It explained where the body had been hidden. And it was signed with a name that appeared nowhere in the original investigation. The name belonged to someone who had never been a suspect, someone who had never been questioned, someone who, by the time the letter was discovered, had been dead for 6 years. The silence that had surrounded Michael Brennan's disappearance was about to break, but the truth it revealed would raise more questions than it answered. Because some confessions do not bring closure. They only deepen the mystery. Michael Brennan was born in Chicago in 1957, the first child of Irish Catholic parents who had settled in the city's south side. His father worked for the Transit Authority. His mother was a schoolteacher. They raised Michael and his younger sister Claire in a modest bungalow near Marquette Park. Michael was a quiet child. He excelled in mathematics and spent much of his free time reading or building model airplanes in the basement. He was not athletic, not particularly social, but he was dependable. Teachers described him as diligent. His parents called him responsible. After graduating from high school in 1975, Michael attended Loyola University, where he studied accounting. He graduated with honors in 1979 and took a job with a small firm downtown. He worked there for 12 years, handling tax returns and financial audits for local businesses. His life followed a predictable pattern. He woke early, took the bus to work, spent his days reviewing spreadsheets and ledgers, and returned home in the evening. He ate dinner alone, often takeout from a nearby diner. He watched the news. He read the Tribune. On weekends, he did laundry, paid bills, and occasionally visited the Art Institute or walked along the lakefront. He had a few acquaintances at work, but no close friends. He dated sporadically, but never seriously. His co-workers described him as polite but distant. His neighbors barely knew his name. Michael's apartment was a one-bedroom unit on the third floor of a brick building on Fullerton Avenue. The building was old but well-maintained, with high ceilings and hardwood floors. His apartment was sparsely furnished: a couch, a television, a small dining table, bookshelves lined with paperbacks and financial journals. There were no photographs on the walls, no personal mementos. The space felt temporary, as if Michael had never fully settled in, even though he had lived there for 5 years. His routine was rigid. He left for work at the same time every morning. He returned at the same time every evening. He bought groceries on Saturday mornings at the Jewel Osco on Clark Street. He did his banking on Friday afternoons at the branch near his office. People who knew him said he seemed content, or at least unbothered. He did not complain, he did not confide. He simply existed within the narrow boundaries of his life. But beneath that surface, there were cracks. Michael's parents had moved to Arizona in 1988, seeking warmer weather and a quieter retirement. His sister Claire had married and relocated to Boston in 1985. Michael rarely spoke to either of them. He sent Christmas cards. He made occasional phone calls, but the distance between them was more than geographic. Claire would later tell investigators that her brother had always been difficult to reach, even when they lived in the same city. He did not share his thoughts. He did not ask for help. He seemed to prefer solitude. At work, Michael was competent but unremarkable. He handled his assignments without complaint, but he never sought advancement. He attended office gatherings out of obligation, not interest. He left as soon as it was polite to do so. His supervisor, a man named Gerald Hoffman, described Michael as reliable but detached. "He did his job," Hoffman said, "but you never got the sense he cared about it." Or about much of anything, really. There was one exception. In the summer of 1991, Michael began volunteering at a community center in Uptown. The center offered tutoring and job training for low-income residents. Michael helped with tax preparation and financial literacy classes. It was out of character. Michael had never shown interest in volunteer work before. But for 3 months, he spent his Tuesday and Thursday evenings at the center, patiently explaining tax forms and budgeting strategies to people who had little formal education. The center's director, a woman named Linda Ortiz, remembered him as kind and patient. "He was good with people," she said. "Quiet, but good. He made them feel like their questions mattered." Michael never explained why he started volunteering. He never mentioned it to his co-workers or neighbors. It was simply something he did quietly and without fanfare. And then, in mid-October, he stopped showing up. Linda Ortiz called his apartment several times. No answer. She assumed he had lost interest or gotten busy with work. It was not until weeks later, when she saw a missing persons bulletin, that she realized something was wrong. By then, Michael Brennan had been gone for over a month. Chicago in 1991 was a city of contrasts. Downtown, the Loop was thriving. New office towers were under construction. The financial district hummed with activity, but in the neighborhoods, the scars of deindustrialization were still visible. Factories stood empty. Storefronts were boarded up. Crime rates remained high in certain areas. The city was also in transition technologically. Pagers were common. Cell phones were rare and expensive. Surveillance cameras were limited to banks and high-security buildings. Most people still used payphones and answering machines. It was a world where anonymity was easy, where a person could move through the city without leaving a digital trace. Where disappearing, if you wanted to, was not difficult. But Michael Brennan had not wanted to disappear. He had simply walked out of his apartment one Friday morning and never returned. And for 28 years, no one knew why. October 18, 1991, began like any other Friday for Michael Brennan. He woke at 6:15. He showered, dressed in his navy suit, and made instant coffee in the small kitchen of his Lincoln Park apartment. He ate a piece of toast standing at the counter. He checked his briefcase to make sure he had the files he needed for the day. At 7:30, he locked his apartment door and walked down the 3 flights of stairs to the street. A neighbor, Mrs. Elaine Kowalski, was retrieving her newspaper from the front stoop. She nodded at Michael. He nodded back. They did not speak. They never did. Michael walked north on Fullerton Avenue toward the bus stop on Clark Street. The morning was cool and overcast. Leaves littered the sidewalk. The city was waking up slowly, the streets still quiet before the rush of commuters. At the bus stop, Michael stood beside 2 other people. One was a young woman in a waitress uniform. The other was an older man reading the Tribune. Neither of them knew Michael. Neither of them would remember him later. The bus arrived at 7:42. Michael boarded and took a seat near the back. He stared out the window as the bus moved south through the city. That was the last confirmed sighting of Michael Brennan. He did not arrive at his office. His secretary, a woman named Diane Marsh, noticed his absence immediately. Michael was never late. He never missed work without calling. Diane tried his home phone at 9 o'clock, no answer. She tried again at 10. Still nothing. She mentioned it to Gerald Hoffman, Michael's supervisor, who shrugged and said Michael would probably show up after lunch. But he did not. By the end of the day, Diane was concerned. She called Michael's apartment again. The phone rang and rang. She left a message on his answering machine. Over the weekend, she tried several more times. No response. On Monday morning, Hoffman called the building manager and asked him to check Michael's apartment. The manager, a man named Frank DeLuca, used a spare key to enter. The apartment was undisturbed. The bed was made, the kitchen was clean. The mail from Friday and Saturday sat unopened on the counter. Michael's winter coat hung in the closet. His television was off. His answering machine blinked with messages. There were no signs of struggle, no blood, no broken furniture, no indication that anything violent had occurred. But Michael's wallet, keys, and briefcase were gone. So were the clothes he had been wearing that morning. DeLuca called the police. The responding officers took a report and conducted a brief search of the apartment. They found nothing unusual. Michael's bank statements showed no recent large withdrawals. His checkbook was balanced. His rent was paid through the end of the month. There were no threatening letters, no evidence of drug use or gambling debts, no signs of mental distress. Michael Brennan had simply vanished. Detectives from the 18th District began a standard missing persons investigation. They interviewed Michael's co-workers, neighbors, and the few people who knew him. They checked hospitals, morgues, and homeless shelters. They contacted his family in Arizona and Boston. No one had heard from him. No one had any idea where he might have gone. Detectives canvassed the bus route Michael would have taken that morning. They spoke to drivers and regular passengers. No one remembered seeing him. The bus company had no surveillance cameras in 1991. They checked Michael's bank account. No activity after October 17th. His credit cards had not been used. His social security number had not appeared in any employment or tax records. They searched vacant lots and construction sites near his apartment. They dragged sections of the Chicago River. They checked with Amtrak and Greyhound to see if Michael had purchased a ticket out of the city. Nothing. Michael Brennan had not left a trail. He had not left a note. He had not told anyone he was leaving. He had simply stepped onto a bus one Friday morning and disappeared. Detectives considered several possibilities. Suicide. But there was no body, no note, no history of depression. Michael's co-workers and neighbors described him as quiet but stable. There were no warning signs, foul play. But there was no evidence of a crime, no witnesses, no suspects, no motive. Michael had no enemies, no debts, no conflicts with anyone. Voluntary disappearance. But why? Michael had a steady job, a stable life, no apparent reason to flee. And if he had wanted to start over somewhere else, why leave without his savings, his belongings, his identification? The case stalled. Weeks turned into months. The investigation slowed. Detectives moved on to other cases. Michael's file was transferred to the cold case unit, where it joined thousands of other unsolved disappearances. His family held out hope for a while. His sister Claire called the police every few months for updates. His parents placed ads in newspapers and hired a private investigator, who found nothing. Eventually, they stopped calling. They stopped searching. They accepted that Michael was gone and that they would probably never know why. The city moved on. The case faded from memory. Michael Brennan became a statistic, a name in a database, a face on a missing persons bulletin that no one looked at anymore. But somewhere in the city, someone knew what had happened. Someone had seen Michael that morning. Someone had been with him when he disappeared, and that person had written a letter. The initial investigation into Michael Brennan's disappearance was thorough but ultimately fruitless. Detectives followed every lead, interviewed every potential witness, and explored every plausible theory, but in the end, they had nothing. The lead detective on the case was a man named Thomas Riley, a 20-year veteran of the Chicago Police Department. Riley was methodical and patient, the kind of investigator who believed that every case could be solved if you asked enough questions and looked hard enough. But Michael Brennan's case tested that belief. Riley began by constructing a timeline of Michael's final days. He reviewed Michael's work schedule, his bank records, his phone logs. He spoke to everyone who had seen or spoken to Michael in the week before he disappeared. The picture that emerged was unremarkable. Michael had gone to work every day. He had attended a staff meeting on Wednesday. He had eaten lunch alone at a diner on Thursday. He had stopped at the bank on Friday afternoon to deposit a check. There were no unusual phone calls, no unexpected visitors, no changes in routine. Riley interviewed Michael's co-workers at length. They all said the same thing. Michael was quiet, competent, and unremarkable. He did his job. He kept to himself. He did not socialize outside of work. Gerald Hoffman, Michael's supervisor, told Riley that Michael had seemed distracted in the weeks before he disappeared. Not upset, Hoffman said, just somewhere else. Like his mind was on something. But Hoffman could not say what that something was, and no one else had noticed anything unusual. Riley also spoke to Linda Ortiz, the director of the community center where Michael had been volunteering. She told him that Michael had been a dedicated volunteer, patient and kind with the people he helped, but she also mentioned something that caught Riley's attention. In early October, Michael had asked her about a man who had been attending the financial literacy classes. The man was in his late 20s, quiet and polite. He had been coming to the center for several weeks. Michael had asked Linda if she knew anything about him, where he lived, what he did for work. Linda had found the question odd. Michael had never shown interest in the personal lives of the people he tutored. She told Riley that she did not know much about the man. His name was David. He had mentioned working in construction. He had not provided a last name or contact information, which was not unusual. Many of the people who used the center preferred to remain anonymous. Riley asked if David had continued attending the classes after Michael stopped showing up. Linda checked her records. David had attended one more session on October 22nd, 4 days after Michael disappeared. After that, he never returned. Riley tried to track down David. He reviewed the center's sign-in sheets, but David had never provided a last name or address. He interviewed other people who had attended the classes, but no one knew much about him. He was just a guy who had shown up for a few weeks and then stopped coming. Riley checked construction companies in the area, but without a last name or physical description, the search went nowhere. David had vanished as completely as Michael. Riley also investigated Michael's family. He spoke to Claire, Michael's sister, who told him that she and Michael had not been close. They spoke a few times a year, usually on holidays. Michael had never mentioned any problems or concerns. Michael's parents, who were in their 70s and living in Arizona, were devastated by their son's disappearance. They could not understand it. Michael had always been responsible, predictable. He would never just leave without telling anyone. Riley asked if Michael had any enemies, any conflicts, any secrets. They said no. Michael had always been a quiet, solitary person. He did not get into trouble. He did not make waves. Riley also looked into Michael's finances. He reviewed bank statements, credit card records, and tax returns. Everything was in order. Michael lived modestly, saved regularly, and had no debts. There were no large withdrawals, no unusual transactions, no signs of financial distress. Riley checked with the Illinois Department of Motor Vehicles. Michael's driver's license had not been renewed. His car, a 1985 Honda Accord, was still parked in the lot behind his apartment building. Riley checked with the Social Security Administration. Michael's Social Security number had not been used since October 1991. No employment records, no tax filings, no benefits claims. It was as if Michael Brennan had ceased to exist. Riley also considered the possibility that Michael had been the victim of a random crime. Chicago in 1991 had a high crime rate. Muggings, assaults, and homicides were common, especially in certain neighborhoods. But there was no evidence of a crime, no witnesses, no reports of violence near Michael's apartment or along his usual route to work. No unidentified bodies matching Michael's description had turned up in the city or surrounding areas. Riley checked with the Cook County Medical Examiner's Office. No John Does matching Michael's description had been brought in during the weeks and months after his disappearance. He also checked with hospitals and psychiatric facilities. No one matching Michael's description had been admitted. Riley even considered the possibility that Michael had been abducted. But there was no ransom demand, no evidence of a struggle, no reason to believe that anyone would want to kidnap a quiet accountant with no money or connections. The investigation dragged on for months. Riley followed every lead, no matter how small. He re-interviewed witnesses. He reviewed the case file again and again, looking for something he might have missed, but there was nothing. By the spring of 1992, the case had gone cold. Riley had exhausted every avenue of investigation. He had no suspects, no witnesses, no evidence. Michael Brennan had simply vanished, and there was no way to know why or how. Riley moved on to other cases, but he never forgot Michael. The case haunted him. It was the one that got away, the one he could not solve. Years later, after Riley retired, he would tell other detectives that the Brennan case was the most frustrating of his career. "We did everything right," he said. "We followed every lead. We checked every box, but we never found him, and we never found out what happened." The case file was eventually moved to storage. Michael's family stopped calling. The city forgot about him. But the truth was still out there, waiting to be discovered. By 1993, Michael Brennan's disappearance had faded from public memory. The case file sat in a storage room in the basement of the 18th District Station, buried beneath stacks of other unsolved cases. Detective Thomas Riley had moved on. He continued to work homicides and missing persons cases, but the Brennan case remained unresolved, a quiet failure that lingered in the back of his mind. Michael's family had also moved on, in the way that people do when hope runs out. His parents, now in their mid-70s, had stopped calling the police for updates. They had stopped placing ads in newspapers. They had stopped searching. Claire, Michael's sister, had tried to keep the case alive for a while. She called the police every few months, asking if there were any new leads. She hired a private investigator in 1992, but he found nothing that the police had not already uncovered. Eventually, she stopped calling too. She had a family of her own now, a life that demanded her attention. Michael became a painful memory, a brother she had lost and would never find. The years passed. The city changed. The skyline grew taller. Technology advanced. The world became smaller and more connected, but Michael Brennan remained missing. In 1995, Michael's father died of a heart attack. His mother followed 2 years later. Neither of them ever learned what had happened to their son. Claire inherited their belongings, including a box of photographs and documents related to Michael's disappearance. She stored the box in her attic and tried not to think about it. The case file remained in storage, untouched. Occasionally, a new detective would review it, looking for something that previous investigators had missed. But the file was thin. There were no witnesses, no evidence, no leads. Just a man who had walked out of his apartment one morning and never returned. In 2001, the Chicago Police Department began digitizing old case files. Michael Brennan's file was scanned and uploaded to a database. His photograph, a grainy black and white image from his driver's license, was added to a national missing persons registry. But no one came forward with information. No one recognized his face. No one knew what had happened to him. The case remained cold. Detective Riley retired in 2005. He had solved hundreds of cases during his career, but the Brennan case still bothered him. He kept a copy of the case file in his home office, and he would occasionally review it, hoping to see something he had missed. But there was nothing. The case was a dead end. In 2010, the 18th District Station was renovated. Old case files were moved to a centralized storage facility on the south side. Michael Brennan's file was packed into a box with dozens of others and transported across the city. The case was now 20 years old. The people who had known Michael were scattered. Some had moved away, some had died. The city had changed so much that the Chicago of 1991 felt like a different world. The community center where Michael had volunteered had closed in 1998. Linda Ortiz, the director, had retired and moved to Florida. The building had been converted into condominiums. Michael's apartment building on Fullerton Avenue was still standing, but it had been renovated. The old tenants were gone. No one who lived there now remembered Michael Brennan. The case had become a ghost story, a mystery with no resolution. Michael was one of thousands of people who had disappeared in Chicago over the decades. Their fates unknown, their stories forgotten. But somewhere in the city, the truth still existed. In 2013, a man named David Keller died in a hospice facility on the north side. He was 51 years old. He had been diagnosed with terminal cancer 6 months earlier. Keller had lived a quiet life. He worked as a carpenter. He had never married. He had no children. He had a few friends, but no one who knew him well. In the weeks before his death, Keller became increasingly withdrawn. He spent most of his time alone in his room, staring out the window or writing in a notebook. The hospice staff assumed he was reflecting on his life, as many dying patients do. They did not ask what he was writing. They did not intrude on his privacy. After Keller died, his belongings were packed into boxes and stored in a facility on the south side. There was no family to claim them, no one to go through his things. Among his belongings was a sealed envelope. It was addressed to the Chicago Police Department. It had never been mailed. The envelope sat in storage for 6 years. In 2019, the storage facility was sold. The new owners began clearing out unclaimed items. Keller's belongings were scheduled to be discarded, but before they were thrown away, a worker noticed the envelope. It was addressed to the police. The worker thought it might be important. He brought it to a nearby post office and asked if it could be delivered. The postal worker took the envelope and added it to the outgoing mail. But the envelope never reached the police department. Somehow it slipped behind a sorting machine at a postal facility on the south side. It remained there, hidden and forgotten, for several months. And then, in the autumn of 2019, a postal worker discovered it during a routine maintenance check. The envelope was yellowed and worn. The postmark was smudged, but the address was still legible. The postal worker sent it to the Chicago Police Department. When the envelope was opened, the letter inside was brief and direct. "I killed Michael Brennan. I need someone to know." The letter was signed, David Keller. The letter arrived at the Chicago Police Department's cold case unit on a gray afternoon in October 2019, 28 years after Michael Brennan disappeared. Detective Sarah Nguyen was the one who opened it. Nguyen was 36 years old, a 12-year veteran of the department. She had been assigned to the cold case unit for 3 years, and she had seen her share of strange developments. Old evidence resurfacing, deathbed confessions, anonymous tips that led nowhere. But this was different. The letter was handwritten in blue ink on plain white paper. The handwriting was shaky but legible. The words were simple and direct. "I killed Michael Brennan. I need someone to know." The letter went on to describe what had happened on the morning of October 18, 1991. David Keller had met Michael Brennan at the community center in Uptown. Michael had been tutoring Keller in financial literacy. They had spoken several times over the course of a few weeks. On that Friday morning, Keller had been waiting at the bus stop on Clark Street. He had seen Michael and approached him. They had talked briefly. Keller had asked Michael if they could meet later that day to discuss something personal. Michael had agreed. They had arranged to meet at a construction site near the river where Keller was working. The letter described what happened next. Keller and Michael had argued. The details were vague, but the letter suggested that Keller had asked Michael for money. Michael had refused. The argument had escalated. Keller had pushed Michael. Michael had fallen and struck his head on a piece of rebar. He had died almost instantly. Keller had panicked. He had hidden Michael's body in a section of the construction site that was being filled with concrete later that day. The body had been buried beneath the foundation of a building that was completed in early 1992. The letter provided the address of the building. It was a commercial structure on the near west side, not far from the United Center. Keller's letter ended with a simple statement: "I never meant to kill him, but I did, and I've carried it with me every day since. I'm dying now. I need someone to know." The letter was signed and dated. David Keller, August 2013. Nguyen read the letter twice. Then she pulled up the case file for Michael Brennan. The file was thin: a missing persons report, a few witness statements, a summary of the initial investigation, no suspects, no leads, no resolution. Nguyen checked the name David Keller. She found a death certificate. Keller had died in September 2013 at a hospice facility on the north side. Cause of death: pancreatic cancer. She also found a brief criminal record. Keller had been arrested twice in the 1980s, once for petty theft and once for disorderly conduct. Both charges had been minor. He had served no jail time. Nguyen ran a search for the address Keller had provided in the letter. The building was still standing. It was a 3-story commercial structure that housed a printing company and several small offices. She contacted the building's owner and explained the situation. The owner was shocked. He had purchased the building in 2005 and had no knowledge of its construction history. Nguyen requested permission to conduct a ground-penetrating radar scan of the building's foundation. The owner agreed. A team from the Cook County Medical Examiner's Office arrived 2 days later. They used radar equipment to scan the concrete slab beneath the building's ground floor. The scan revealed an anomaly: a dense mass, roughly the size and shape of a human body, buried approximately 6 feet beneath the surface. Nguyen obtained a warrant. A construction crew was hired to excavate the area. The work took 3 days. The crew carefully removed layers of concrete and soil, working slowly to avoid damaging any potential evidence. On the 3rd day, they found human remains. The skeleton was intact. It was lying on its side, curled in a fetal position. The clothing had mostly deteriorated, but fragments of fabric remained. A leather briefcase, badly corroded, was found near the body. Inside the briefcase were documents, tax forms, financial statements. A business card with the name Michael Brennan, accountant. The remains were transported to the medical examiner's office. A forensic anthropologist examined the skeleton and determined that it belonged to a male, approximately 30 to 40 years old at the time of death. The skull showed evidence of blunt force trauma consistent with a fall. DNA samples were extracted from the remains and compared to a sample provided by Claire Brennan, Michael's sister. The match was confirmed. The body was Michael Brennan. Nguyen reviewed the case file again, this time with the knowledge of what had happened. She cross-referenced Keller's letter with the original investigation. She found a reference to a man named David who had attended the community center where Michael volunteered. Detective Riley had tried to track him down in 1991, but had been unable to find him. Nguyen pulled Keller's employment records. In 1991, he had been working for a construction company that had been contracted to build the commercial structure on the near West Side. The timeline matched. Nguyen also reviewed Keller's financial records. In late 1991, he had made several large cash deposits into his bank account. The deposits totaled nearly $3,000, roughly the amount that had been in Michael's wallet at the time of his disappearance. The evidence was circumstantial, but it was consistent with Keller's confession. Nguyen contacted Claire Brennan and informed her that her brother's remains had been found. Claire was in her early 60s now, living in Boston with her husband and 2 adult children. She had long since accepted that Michael was gone. But learning the truth, even after so many years, brought a strange mixture of relief and sorrow. "I always wondered," she told Nguyen. "I always hoped he was alive somewhere, living a different life, but I think I knew deep down that he was gone." Claire traveled to Chicago to claim her brother's remains. She arranged for a small funeral service. Michael was buried beside their parents in a cemetery on the South Side. The case was officially closed. Michael Brennan's death was ruled a homicide. David Keller was identified as the perpetrator. But because Keller was dead, no charges were filed, no trial was held, no justice was served in the traditional sense. The letter that had revealed the truth had been written 6 years before it was discovered. It had been lost in the postal system, trapped behind a sorting machine waiting in silence. If the letter had been delivered in 2013 when Keller wrote it, the case would have been solved 6 years earlier, but it had not been delivered. It had been forgotten, and so the truth had waited, buried beneath concrete and lost in the machinery of the city, until someone finally found it. The truth about Michael Brennan's death did not bring the closure that people often imagine. There was no trial, no courtroom drama, no moment of justice delivered. David Keller had been dead for 6 years by the time his confession surfaced. The man who killed Michael Brennan had already faced his own end, alone in a hospice bed, carrying the weight of what he had done. Detective Sarah Nguyen closed the case file in November 2019. She wrote a detailed report summarizing the investigation, the discovery of the remains, and the contents of Keller's confession. She filed it with the cold case unit and moved on to the next case. But the story did not end there. Claire Brennan returned to Boston after her brother's funeral. She brought with her a box of photographs and documents, the same box her parents had kept for years. She added the police report, the autopsy findings, and a copy of Keller's letter. She did not read the letter often, it was too painful, but she kept it because it was the only explanation she would ever have. In the months after Michael's remains were found, Claire tried to piece together what had happened. She reviewed the timeline. She read the original investigation reports. She tried to understand who David Keller was and why he had killed her brother. The answer, as far as she could tell, was simple and tragic. Keller had been desperate. He had asked Michael for money. Michael had refused. A moment of anger had turned into violence, and then, in a panic, Keller had hidden the body and tried to forget what he had done. But he had not forgotten. The letter made that clear. Keller had carried the guilt for 22 years. He had lived with it every day, and in the end, when he knew he was dying, he had tried to confess. But the confession had arrived too late. Claire wondered what would have happened if the letter had been delivered in 2013. Would her parents have still been alive to learn the truth? Would it have brought them peace or only more pain? She would never know. Detective Thomas Riley, who had led the original investigation in 1991, learned about the case's resolution through a phone call from Nguyen. He was 74 years old, retired, and living in a suburb north of the city. When Nguyen told him that Michael Brennan's body had been found, Riley was silent for a long moment. "I always thought he was out there somewhere," Riley said finally. "I thought maybe we'd find him someday. But I never imagined it would be like this." Nguyen asked if he remembered David Keller. Riley did. He remembered the man named David who had attended the community center. He remembered trying to track him down and coming up empty. "I should have pushed harder," Riley said. "I should have found him." Gurion told him that he had done everything he could. The investigation had been thorough. Keller had covered his tracks well. There had been no evidence, no witnesses, no reason to suspect him. But Riley did not seem comforted. The case had haunted him for nearly 30 years, and now, even with the truth revealed, it still haunted him. The building where Michael's body had been buried continued to operate. The printing company and the small offices remained open. The owner had the excavated section of the foundation repaired and reinforced. There was no plaque, no memorial, no indication that a man had been buried there for 28 years. The building was just a building, unremarkable and anonymous, like so many others in the city. But for those who knew the story, it would always be the place where Michael Brennan had been hidden. The community center where Michael and Keller had met no longer existed. It had been closed for over 20 years. The building had been converted into condominiums. The people who lived there now had no idea that a man had once volunteered there, teaching financial literacy to strangers, and that one of those strangers had killed him. Linda Ortiz, the former director of the center, learned about the case through a news article. She was in her 70s now, living in Florida. She remembered Michael clearly. She remembered how patient he had been with the people he tutored. She remembered how kind he had been. She also remembered David. She remembered that Michael had asked about him. She remembered thinking it was odd at the time. She wished she had said something. She wished she had asked more questions. But she had not. And now it was too late. The case received brief media attention. A few local news outlets ran stories about the discovery of Michael's remains and the confession letter that had been lost for years. The stories described the case as tragic and unusual. They noted the strange twist of fate that had delayed the letter's delivery. But the coverage was short-lived. The story faded from the news cycle within a week. There were other cases, other tragedies, other mysteries. The city moved on. Michael Brennan's name was removed from the missing persons database. His case file was marked as closed. His photograph, the grainy black and white image from his driver's license, was archived. He was no longer missing. He was no longer a mystery. He was simply a man who had been killed in a moment of violence and buried beneath concrete for nearly 3 decades. Claire Brennan visited her brother's grave once a year. She brought flowers and stood in silence, thinking about the brother she had barely known. She thought about the life he had lived, quiet and solitary, and the death he had suffered, sudden and senseless. She thought about the letter that had been lost for 6 years. She thought about the silence that had surrounded Michael's disappearance. She thought about the truth that had been buried, both literally and figuratively, for so long. And she thought about the fact that some truths, even when they are finally revealed, do not bring the peace that people hope for. They only bring an end to the waiting. David Keller's grave was in a cemetery on the south side, not far from where Michael was buried. There was no headstone, only a small marker with his name and the dates of his birth and death. No one visited. No one left flowers. Keller had died alone and he was buried alone, but he had left behind a confession, and that confession, delayed and almost lost, had finally given Michael Brennan's family the truth they had been searching for. It was not justice. It was not closure, but it was something. The city of Chicago continued to change. The skyline grew taller, the neighborhoods evolved, the technology advanced, the world became smaller and more connected, but beneath the surface, the past remained. Buried in concrete, hidden in storage rooms, trapped in the machinery of the postal system, and sometimes after decades of silence, the past resurfaced. A letter was found, a body was discovered, a truth was revealed. And the living were left to make sense of it. Michael Brennan had been a quiet man who lived a quiet life. He had disappeared without explanation and had been forgotten by almost everyone. But in the end, someone had remembered. Someone had confessed, and someone had found him. The silence had been broken, the truth had been told, and Michael Brennan, after 28 years, had finally come home.